April 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over, and everyone knows it. The Rhine has been crossed. Berlin is burning. In village after village across Western Germany, white sheets hang from windows, and elderly men in dusty suits stand at roadsides with their hands raised, offering watches, jewellery, and bottles of schnapps to the first American soldier who will listen. The Third Army is moving so fast that supply lines can barely keep up. The men are exhausted, exhilarated, and, crucially, unsupervised for long stretches at a time. And in the chaos of those final weeks, something quietly extraordinary was happening. American soldiers, men who had fought from Normandy through the Ardennes, who had seen friends buried in the mud of France and the snow of Belgium, were sitting down with the people they had been sent to defeat, and they were trading. Not intelligence, not insults, weapons, a rifle for a wristwatch, a pistol for a bottle of cognac, a Luger, that iconic sidearm of the German military, the trophy every GI dreamed of bringing home, for almost anything a German farmer or shopkeeper could offer. The black market was thriving in the ruins of the Third Reich, and American soldiers were enthusiastic participants. When General George S. Patton found out, the reaction was not what anyone might have predicted, and what he did, and more importantly, what he said, reveals something extraordinary about the man, about the army he commanded, and about the peculiar moral world of war's final days. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what the closing weeks of the Second World War actually looked like on the ground. The popular image of victory in Europe is of jubilant soldiers cheering in liberated streets, crowds throwing flowers, a clean and decisive end to 6 years of darkness. That image is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. By April 1945, the German military as a coherent fighting force was disintegrating. Whole divisions were surrendering. Young boys in oversized uniforms were laying down arms at the roadside. But the German civilian population, 12 million people living in the zones being overrun by Allied forces, was in a state of profound dislocation. Homes had been bombed, shops were empty, banks were worthless. The currency of the Reich, the Reichsmark, was becoming toilet paper before people's eyes. What the German civilians had in abundance were the physical remnants of a militarized society. Weapons were everywhere. Families had been issued pistols for home defense. Veterans had kept service weapons as souvenirs. Hunting rifles had been in barns for decades. The Wehrmacht had left behind caches of ammunition and sidearms as units collapsed and scattered. In some villages, there was more firepower sitting in kitchen drawers than in many a small nation's armory. What the American soldiers had were cigarettes, chocolate, tinned food, and, most valuably of all, the ability to simply walk away and leave a German family unmolested. In the moral economy of a defeated nation, that was worth quite a lot. Military regulations, of course, were unambiguous. Soldiers were not to engage in unauthorized trade with civilians. They were certainly not to acquire weapons through private transaction rather than official capture. Looting was a court-martial offence. Fraternization with German civilians was officially prohibited, a policy that was, to put it delicately, somewhat aspirational in practice. Eisenhower's headquarters had issued stern directives. Chaplains had delivered lectures. Officers had read out the relevant articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to men who nodded politely, and then went back to doing exactly as they pleased. The weapons trade was, by any formal measure, a serious disciplinary problem. German sidearms were technically war materiel. Trading for them was trafficking in captured enemy property. And in some cases, men were selling their own issued weapons, American service rifles and pistols, to German civilians who were, under occupation law, absolutely forbidden from possessing firearms at all. It was, on paper, a complete mess. Patton heard about it. There are several accounts of exactly how this came to his attention, and they differ in their particulars, but the essential story is consistent across sources. A subordinate commander. Accounts vary as to whether it was a divisional or corps level officer, brought the matter to Patton formally, expecting the general to come down hard. Patton's reputation, after all, was for iron discipline. This was the man who had slapped a hospitalized soldier for what he considered cowardice, the man whose soldiers reportedly feared him as much as they feared the Germans. Surely he would be outraged. He was not outraged. What Patton said in characteristically colourful terms that cannot be reproduced in full here was something to the effect that his men had just fought their way across Europe and had earned the right to pick up a souvenir or two. He was, reportedly, far less interested in pursuing the soldiers involved than in ensuring that the weapons being traded were properly rendered inoperable before they reached civilian hands, and even that concern was somewhat secondary to his irritation at being brought a problem he considered beneath his attention during the final push into Germany. There is a version of events in which Patton simply refused to act at all. There is another in which he issued an informal directive that was so toothless as to be effectively permission. The precise records are, as so often with Patton, somewhat murky, partly because the general was not always careful about committing his more unorthodox decisions to paper, and partly because the officers around him sometimes found it expedient to keep certain conversations off the record. What is clear is that the weapons trade continued. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. To understand Patton's reaction fully, you need to understand his philosophy of soldiering, a philosophy that was, in many ways, deeply at odds with the institutional army he served. Patton believed, with absolute conviction, that the essential commodity of war was aggression. Not discipline in the conventional sense, not adherence to regulation, not the smooth functioning of administrative machinery, but the willingness of individual soldiers to close with the enemy and destroy them. Everything else was secondary. The paperwork, the directives, the fraternization policies, the weapons trading regulations, these were, in Patton's worldview, the concern of staff officers and rear echelon administrators. His men were fighters, and fighters, in his view, were entitled to a certain latitude. This was not an entirely original position. The tension between the fighting soldier and the administrative army has existed in every military in history, but Patton embodied it with unusual force. He had contempt for what he called the chair-borne army, the vast logistical and administrative apparatus that sustained combat operations but did not share their danger. And he extended that contempt implicitly to the regulations that apparatus generated. There is also something else worth considering. By April 1945, Patton's men had been fighting continuously for the better part of a year. They had landed in Normandy or come across through the Ardennes replacements, and they had moved and fought and bled and moved again. The average rifleman in the Third Army had seen things and done things that no regulation could adequately address. Trading a pistol for a bottle of schnapps was, in the moral calculus of men who had spent months killing people, a fairly minor transgression. Patton understood this. Whatever his faults, and they were considerable and well documented. He had an instinct for the psychology of the combat soldier that his more polished, more politically adroit colleagues sometimes lacked. The broader context matters here too. The weapons trade between American soldiers and German civilians was not unique to the Third Army, nor was it unique to Germany. In the Pacific, in Italy, in France, informal markets had sprung up wherever the front lines produced the conditions for them. Desperate civilians, soldiers with surplus goods, and the general collapse of normal economic life that war produces. It was a human constant, as old as armies themselves. What made the German case distinctive was the sheer volume of weapons available and the speed of the collapse. The Wehrmacht had equipped millions of men, and as those men surrendered or melted away, their weapons did not simply vanish. They entered the grey economy of a defeated society. American soldiers were, in many cases, simply the first link in a chain that would eventually see German hunting rifles and service pistols circulating across Europe for decades. The Luger, in particular, became something of a cultural phenomenon. Millions of American veterans brought one home. They sat in sock drawers and attic boxes across the United States. They were shown to grandchildren and eventually donated to museums or turned into police amnesty programs. The Luger became, in American popular culture, the symbol of the defeated enemy, the tangible proof that a young man from Ohio or Georgia or Pennsylvania had been there, had been part of the great event, had come home. Many of those Lugers had been traded for, not captured. Patton knew this. He chose, with characteristic pragmatism, to look the other way. The legacy of this episode is, in some ways, a small one. No battles were lost because soldiers traded weapons. No German resistance was meaningfully armed by pistols exchanged for chocolate bars. The occupation of Germany proceeded, imperfectly, chaotically, humanly, regardless. But the story tells us something important about the relationship between military law and military reality, about the gap between the army on paper and the army in the field. It tells us something about Patton, about the qualities that made him an extraordinarily effective combat commander and a consistently problematic senior officer. And it tells us something about the soldiers themselves, young men who had been through a great and terrible ordeal, and who were, in the closing days of the war, simply trying to hold on to some small piece of it. Surviving German sidearms from this period can be found in private collections, antique firearms dealerships, and military museums across the United States and Europe. Many are unmarked, their precise origins untraceable. They passed through too many hands, across too many borders, in too chaotic a time. Return now in your mind to that German village in April 1945, the white sheets in the windows, the elderly man at the roadside with his hands raised, the American soldier, 19 years old, 6,000 kilometers from home, considering what to do. He has a rifle on his shoulder, a packet of cigarettes in his breast pocket, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the knowledge that the war is almost over, that he is probably going to live, and that he would very much like something to show for it. The German has a pistol that belonged to his son, who is somewhere on the Eastern Front, and has not written in 3 months. What happens next is not in the regulations. It is not in the training manuals or the directives from Eisenhower's headquarters or the articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is simply 2 human beings on opposite sides of a catastrophic war, finding a transaction they can both live with. Patton heard about it and moved on. There were more important things to worry about. He was probably right. The war ended 3 weeks later.